Hello, my name is Samantha and I'm here today to talk to you some more about the IELTS test. So before I get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about me. So I am an English instructor, an ESL instructor. I've been teaching ESL now for more than 10 years, and more than 8 years of that has been teaching online. I've done a lot of test preparation with my students and a lot of IELTS test preparation specifically. So I would like to share some of my knowledge about this topic for you. Just so you know a little more about me, I was born in Canada, raised in Canada. I live in Canada now. I did travel and live abroad for a while. And I do speak other languages. I speak French and Spanish. So I think that that gives me a different insight into the process of learning a language. So I am a teacher, but I am also a student of language. So I can understand the struggles that come with being a language learner. So also I have a background in science. So I have a bachelor's degree in science and another bachelor's degree in the arts. And I have TESOL certification as well. So that's a little bit about me and my background. I've been teaching English learners of all ages and all levels for more than 10 years, but in the last few years, I have focused more specifically on adult learners, and I've done a lot more test preparation in addition to some other things. But test preparation is something that I really like to teach. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the IELTS test, specifically about the speaking section of that test. So for the structure and timing, the speaking section of the test lasts around 11 to 14 minutes, which makes it one of the shorter segments of the test. But that doesn't mean that it's not as important or as difficult. So it is worth studying quite hard for this section. There are 3 sections within the speaking section of the test, and it takes place face-to-face with an examiner. So that makes it very different from the other sections of the test. So you will be having a conversation with an examiner, and that is how you will be tested. Part 1 of the speaking section of the test includes an introduction and interview. So it takes around 4 to 5 minutes. The interviewer will introduce themselves and ask you some questions about your life. Part 2 is your individual long turn. It takes around 3 to 4 minutes, and you'll be asked to prepare a short talk and speak about a topic for 1 to 2 minutes. I'll talk about all of these parts in more detail shortly as well. And then part 3 is a two-way discussion between you and the examiner. It takes around 4 to 5 minutes. The interviewer will have a longer discussion with you about the topic from part 2. So let's go into more detail for some of these sections and the scoring for the sections. So for the scoring, there are 4 criteria for this section. They're called Fluency and Coherence, Lexical Resource, Grammatical Range and Accuracy, and Pronunciation. So each criteria is scored on a scale from 0 to 9. So we are going to look at some of those criteria in more detail soon. The subject matter of the speaking section of the test include your family life, sports and recreation, education, tourism and travel, the environment, the internet, advertising. Section 1 is just about you and your life, the short interview. Sections 2 and 3 are on these topics, so it's still often relating to you and your life in some way. It might ask you about your experiences relating to one of these topics. So these are some topics to be familiar with, and you should be practicing questions based on these topics. So for fluency and coherence, it means how clear and structured your speech is, basically. To increase your score, you should be avoiding repetition. You should connect your sentences with linking words. You should pause appropriately. And you should answer with fully developed answers with appropriate detail. So you do not want to be saying the same things over and over. Don't repeat yourself. Connecting your sentences with linking words can mean basically to not have very, very short, simple sentences. So you shouldn't just say, I like dogs, for example. End of sentence. That's very short. That's not showing that you have a wide range of vocabulary. So you can say, I really love most breeds of dogs because I grew up with a dog and I think that they're really friendly and really wonderful. So things like because, it sounds very simple. I'm sure you know how to use the word because, but you have to make sure that you are including multiple ideas and that you're not having incredibly short sentences. So having things like and because can help you to continue your explanation. Pausing appropriately is basically just pausing in the way that you would in a conversation, a regular, somewhat formal conversation, not a really excited conversation with your friends, maybe, where you wouldn't pause so much, but you should be pausing in between words as appropriate, or pausing at the ends of sentences, at the ends of ideas, just in a normal way. You don't have to think about that too much. You just have to make sure that you're not pausing for a really long amount of time to think, or that you're never pausing and you're just talking very quickly without any pauses. And fully developed answers with appropriate detail, similar to what I said about liking dogs. Instead of just saying, I like dogs, you need to give a reason. So it has to be a developed answer and it has to have the appropriate amount of information to give them. So looking in a little more detail at the scores for fluency and coherence, you can see, so from the band scores of 0 to 9, we'll start at the top. So this is what you're aiming for. Of course, level 9 is a very high level of fluency, but this is what you should be trying to accomplish. So someone who gets a score of 9 speaks fluently with only rare repetition or self-correction. Any hesitation is content related rather than to find words or grammar. So you can actually stop to think, of course. Even a native speaker will pause sometimes or hesitate sometimes, but it's not because you can't think of a word. So, which is fine if you do need to think of a word, but the fewer times you do that, the more fluent and native sounding you will be. Speaks coherently with fully appropriate cohesive features. So you will be coherent, they can understand you. Your sentences are structured in a nice way that makes it easy for them to understand. Develops topics fully and appropriately. Again, not saying just a yes or a no or a very short answer, but you're developing your topic, you're answering very appropriately. If they ask you a question, you're giving the answer for that question. So then if you go down a score, one band to band 8, then you would be speaking fluently with only occasional repetition or self-correction. Hesitation is usually content related and only rarely to search for language. So this is a little more obtainable score for non-native speakers. You can still hesitate a little, you can stop to think of some words or to correct yourself, but it's not happening all the time in all of your sentences. And then develops topics coherently and appropriately. So you have to still be coherent, they have to understand you, and you are answering the question appropriately. So that's an 8. We'll quickly go over some of the others. So score 7 would be speaks at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. So that's good. May demonstrate language-related hesitation at times or some repetition and or self-correction. So you're correcting yourself or hesitating more than that person who gets a score of 8. Uses a range of connectives and discourse markers with some flexibility. So you are connecting your sentences in creative ways sometimes, but not always. So you might have some limited structure. Level 6 would be, is willing to speak at length, though may lose coherence at times due to occasional repetition, self-correction, or hesitation. So they are losing the understanding of what you're saying sometimes because of how often you're hesitating or how much you have to correct yourself. And then you're using a range of connectives and discourse markers, but sometimes you're doing it wrong. So you're trying to use this type of language, but you're not doing it perfectly. We'll go down to some of the lower scores. Score 5. So you are repeating yourself sometimes, you're correcting, or you may speak slowly to be able to keep going. You may overuse certain connectives and discourse markers. So you might be trying to use a range of speech, but you might not be doing it naturally. And complex communication causes fluency problems. So when you try to be more complex, it makes it harder to understand you. Level 4, cannot respond without noticeable pauses and may speak slowly with frequent repetition and self-correction. So a lot more hesitation in your speech and correction. Links basic sentences, but with repetitious use of simple connectives and some breakdowns in coherence. Okay, so you're linking some basic sentences, but you're not doing it really fluently and perfectly. Level 3 would be speaking with very long pauses, having a limited ability to link your simple sentences, and giving only simple responses and being unable to convey your thoughts, so unable to explain your answers. Level 2, you're pausing for a very long time before most of your words, not just some of your words, and there is little communication possible. Level 1 is no communication possible. They can't rate your language at all, so I'm sure that none of you would get a 1. And then 0 would be just not attending at all. So no one will get a 0 if you attend the test. So those are the scores that you can try to achieve. So just to give you a better idea, of course, most of my students are not trying to get a 9. 9 is a very high level of fluency, but you can aim for that and know that if you get lower than a 9, you're still doing great, but those are the goals that you're trying to reach. Okay, lexical resource. So this is basically your vocabulary usage. To increase your score, you can share knowledge of a wide range of vocabulary. So you're using lots of different types of words easily. Show that you can discuss a wide variety of topics comfortably. So this is a great sign of how fluent you are if you can talk about anything that people want to talk about without having a lot of hesitation. Try not to speak too informally. So you're not going to speak to someone as though they're your best friend. This is an examiner, so you're just being a little more polite and respectful and a little more formal. So we don't have a completely different structure for formal language in English versus informal language. Some languages have rules and different words to use, different endings to use for words. We don't have that, but you can still show a level of respect and formality. It doesn't have to be incredibly formal, just speak as though you are speaking to a teacher rather than a best friend or a child, of course. Use idioms appropriately. So the ability to use an idiom in your conversation really shows that you're a comfortable, fluent speaker. If you use it correctly, if you use them incorrectly, then it shows that you've tried and that you know the expression, but you might not be comfortable with it. So an idiom, just in case you're not familiar, is an expression that if you look at each of the words in the expression, the meaning is not obvious. So for example, it's raining cats and dogs. If you look at the words rain, cats, dogs, you would think it's something relating to animals. It's nothing relating to animals. It just means that it's raining very hard. So the expression might have an interesting origin. A lot of them do. They have a story about how they started to say these things or why they started to say them. But if you look at it, you might be confused the first time you hear it. But if you're able to use a sentence that's like that, then it shows that you're more fluent. So an idiom, not all of them are quite as strange as that one, but it's just a phrase that if you break it down, it's a little hard to understand. But if you have the full expression, then it has a specific meaning. So if you can insert something like that into your speech, naturally, then it can show that you're very fluent. And these are things to be careful not to memorize too much or try to insert something where it's not really appropriate. It's good to learn lots of idioms just for your fluency in general, but it's good to learn some more common idioms that maybe can fit into conversation easily. In more detail, we will read about a very high score, so a score of 9. So a person who gets this score uses vocabulary with full flexibility and precision in all topics. So they were really not limited at all by their vocabulary. Then uses idiomatic language naturally and accurately. So they're using idioms. They're doing it really naturally, really accurately, really perfectly. So like a native speaker would. Then level 8 would be uses a wide range of vocabulary flexibly to convey precise meaning. So you're doing it very well. Maybe not perfect, but close to perfect. And then it uses less common and idiomatic vocabulary skillfully with occasional inaccuracies. So you're using idioms, you're using less common vocabulary, but you're making some mistakes, not a lot though. And then uses paraphrase effectively as required. So if you have to paraphrase something, then you're doing it accurately and effectively. So changing, like paraphrasing what someone said, you could be talking about something that someone told you once, you're paraphrasing them, you're making it a shorter version, you're not quoting them. That is a nice skill to be able to take someone else's words or something that you've read and put it in your own words. It's really important. So a level 7 would be using your vocabulary resource flexibly to discuss a variety of topics, using some less common and idiomatic vocabulary and showing some awareness of style and collocation with some inappropriate choices. So basically just you're using some less common vocabulary well, but not always perfectly, and sometimes you're choosing the wrong words. And you're still using paraphrasing effectively. For number 6, has a wide enough vocabulary to discuss topics at length and make meaning clear in spite of inappropriacies. So you're able to discuss these topics at length and make your meaning clear even though you have mistakes, and then generally paraphrases successfully. So it might not be 100% perfect when you're using a wide range of vocabulary or when you're paraphrasing, but you're still successful. The person can still understand you. Okay, Lexical Resource, level 5. Manages to talk about familiar and unfamiliar topics, but uses vocabulary with limited flexibility. Attempts to use paraphrase, but with mixed success. So you're trying to paraphrase, but you sometimes are doing it well, sometimes you're not. And then you're trying to talk about unfamiliar topics, but again, you have some limitations on that. Level 4, you're talking about familiar topics, but can only convey basic meaning on unfamiliar topics, and you make frequent mistakes in the choices of your words. And then level 4 also rarely attempts paraphrase, so you're not using that. Just, yeah. Okay, Lexical Resource level 3, so a very low level for your score. Uses simple vocabulary to convey personal information, has insufficient vocabulary for less familiar topics. So you're very limited by your vocabulary. And number 2, only produces isolated words or memorized utterances. So you can say words and you can say some short memorized things, but you can't actually have a conversation with your vocabulary. Okay, moving on to grammatical range and accuracy. So this can mean having correct grammar and using a variety of structures accurately. To increase your score for this section, you should avoid making grammatical errors and you should be using a variety of grammatical structures. So you're not just using very simple sentence structures. And of course, you can make mistakes, but the more mistakes you make, the lower your score will be on this section. So a level 9, a high-level speaker, a near native speaker, would use a full range of structures naturally and appropriately. They would produce consistently accurate structures apart from slips, characteristic of native speaker speech. So again, you're speaking like a native. You can still make mistakes. Natives make mistakes all the time. I just kind of did. But it's just about maybe not knowing what word you're going to say next. But it's not about having a lack of knowledge of vocabulary or grammar. So number 8, you're using a wide range of structures flexibly, and the majority of your sentences are error-free, and very rarely you make some inappropriate choices. Level 7, you're using a wide range, not a wide range, but a range of complex structures with some flexibility, and frequently you produce error-free sentences, but you're still making more mistakes than a person at that level 8. Level 6 would use a mix of simple and complex structures, but you are limited in your flexibility. You might make frequent mistakes with complex structures, but it's not making it impossible for the person to understand you. So you're making mistakes, but you can still be understood. Level 5 would be producing basic sentence forms with reasonable accuracy, using a limited range of more complex structures, but they usually have errors and they might make it a little more difficult to understand you. Level 4 would be producing basic sentence forms and some correct simple sentences, but subordinate structures are rare. Errors are frequent and may lead to misunderstanding. So they're having trouble understanding you at that point because of your errors. Level 3, you're attempting basic sentence forms, but you're having trouble with that, or you're only using memorized sentences or phrases, and you're making a lot of mistakes outside of your memorized phrases or sentences. And then level 2, you can't make basic sentences at all. Okay, pronunciation. The meaning of pronunciation is basically saying the words in the correct way. So you need to be using correct word stress and having clear speech as well. To increase your score on this section, you should be sure to speak clearly and enunciate your words. So enunciation is making sure that your mouth is open in the proper way so that they can hear you. So mumbling would be keeping your lips kind of closed when you're speaking. Maybe if you're really lazy or tired and you're talking to friends or family, you might not open your mouth to have really clear sounds. Enunciation, you should be sure to, you can even study the shapes of mouths and what they should be doing when you are making certain sounds, but just making sure that you're speaking clearly. Using proper word stress is important because sometimes when you stress the wrong syllable, it makes it sound like a different word, or it changes the word, or it just makes it very hard to understand. And then ensure that the evaluator that will be able to understand you without difficulty. So that is important. The evaluator needs to be able to understand you. For pronunciation, looking at a very high perfect score, so a score of 9, uses a full range of pronunciation features with precision and subtlety, sustains flexible use of features throughout, and is effortless to understand. So that's the most important line here. No one has any trouble understanding you. It is completely effortless. Level 8, you're still using a wide range of pronunciation features. You have some occasional lapses, but you're easy to understand throughout, and your accent has minimal effect on your intelligibility. So they can understand you. Your speech is clear. You might have an accent, but it doesn't change the level of understanding of the person speaking to you. For level 7, they're just saying you show some of the positive features or all of the positive features of band 6, but not all of band 8. So we'll look at band 6 next. Okay, so band 6 uses a range of pronunciation features with mixed control. The more important line here is can generally be understood throughout, though mispronunciation of individual words or sounds reduces the clarity at times. So you can be understood, but there will be some mispronunciation sometimes. That makes it a little less clear. And level 5, you're showing all of the level 4 skills, but not all of the level 6 skills yet. Level 4 is mispronunciations are frequent and cause some difficulty for the listener. So you're mispronouncing quite a few things, and that is a little confusing for the person who is listening to you and evaluating. Level 3, again, you're meeting level 2, but not level 4. Level 2, your speech is often unintelligible, so not able to be understood. So the person who is listening to you can't understand what you're saying. Okay, so part 1, an overview of this section of the speaking segment of the test. It is the introduction and interview. The examiner will introduce him or herself, and then they will ask you some questions about yourself and about your life. Some of the types of questions that you could hear on this segment of the test would be about what you study. So if you are studying currently, they'll ask you about your current studies. If you're working, they might ask you about what you did study in the past. And then they might ask, did you find it difficult? What part of it was difficult? What did you find interesting? They might ask you some questions relating to that. Then where do you work? So if you're working now, they'll want to know where you work, what kind of work you do. Some other questions you might hear are, what are your working hours like? Are you thinking about changing your job? Then they often will ask you questions about your family or about your home life. So you should be prepared to talk about this topic. So some potential questions are, do you have a big family? Can you tell me something about them? Do you get on well with your family? That's kind of a British phrase, I think, get on well. We would say get along well in North America. But you should be ready to talk about the people you live with, the people in your family. Those are really typical questions for this section of the test. Some more questions you might hear are about your hometown. So where's your hometown? Do you like your hometown? Do you often visit? What can visitors do there? How could it be improved? Has it changed a lot since you were a child? So your hometown is a very common topic to be asked about in this section of the test. So I think you should be ready to talk about it. Know some stories you can tell about it, some general things about your hometown and your opinion on it. And then what do you suggest that a visitor should see or do in your country? A lot of questions can be about your home country as well, instead of just hometown. Are there any traditional arts or music you would recommend? In what ways has tourism changed your country? So those are some potential questions about your country. And you should just be prepared to talk about where you're from. Then what kinds of food do you like to eat? What kind of new food would you like to try? Do you like cooking? Do you prefer home cooked food or food from restaurants? So anything relating to food could be asked. That's not asked every time, of course, but it's something that you should be familiar with just in case. Think about some of your favorite foods, your favorite dishes, and you should be able to talk about them. Do you have any hobbies or interests? This is a really important thing to study in advance. It's a very common question. So if you have any hobbies that you love to do, that you love to talk about in your native language, you should be sure that you know the vocabulary needed to talk about that same topic in English. So sometimes there are very specific words that could come up when you're talking about a specific hobby. You should be sure that you're familiar with them. They might ask you how you became interested in that hobby, how you like to spend your holidays or your free time. Those are some typical questions. Do you like reading books? What kinds of books do you like to read? Do other people in your family like to read? Your daily routine is another common topic. So they might ask you to tell them about your typical weekday or your typical weekend, or the balance of work, study time, or free time in your life. Daily routine questions are very common for this section of the test. So that's something that you should be familiar with. Pausing so that you can edit this out because I had to do something over here. Sorry. Okay. Some tips for part 1. Don't repeat the question back to the examiner. You can do this sometimes. That's a common thing to do in speech at times. So if they say, what's your favorite sport? Then you can say, my favorite sport is basketball. So you're kind of paraphrasing there, but don't say, what's my favorite, or what's your favorite sport? My favorite sport is, like, you don't have to say exactly what the question is. And if the question is long, you certainly shouldn't be saying it back to them. Paraphrasing is okay, and asking them a question is okay, but don't put the exact question into all of your answers. It just won't sound as comfortable or as natural. Try to speak as though it's a real conversation, but in a formal setting. So try to speak the way that you would normally speak. You want to sound like a native speaker having a conversation with the examiner. So I say a formal setting because it shouldn't sound so casual like it's your best friend, but it should sound like a real conversation. An important thing is, do not give answers that are just a yes or a no. So if they say, for example, just to keep with the sport example, if they say, do you like basketball? For some reason they say that. Don't just say yes or yep or no. That's not enough. So the next line says, try to give reasons, examples, and details for your answers. So don't just say yes. You can say, yes, actually, I really love basketball. I used to play basketball when I was in high school, and now I watch every NBA game that involves my team. I really love this team. Like, you could give some more detail. So you should be explaining a little bit. Even when it could be a very simple answer, like just yes, you should be giving them more information. Tell them why. And that is all for now. So we will continue in the next video, and we'll be talking about the speaking section, but parts 2 and 3, and some general tips for the speaking section. So be sure to tune in next time for the next video, and we will complete the topic of the speaking section of the IELTS test.